So our first speaker, our keynote speaker, is Professor Fiona Mathews. Fiona is the Professor of Environmental Biology at the School of Life Sciences at the University of Sussex, and has a long and varied career integrating ecological and epidemiological approaches. She's widely published on the ecology and conservation of British farmland mammals, and is today, of course, widely respected as one of the UK's prominent bat experts. If you're working in the UK and doing any sort of bat-related work, I'm not referencing Fiona, you're doing something wrong. Her current research includes quantifying the hazards posed by bats and wind turbines, which she'll be talking about today in her presentation, and understanding the effects of roads, street lighting for wildlife. She's been a licensed bat worker for 25 years, is a member of the Natural England's Bat Expert Panel, and contributes to several Eurobat's scientific advisory working groups. Fiona was until recently the chair of the Mammal Society in the UK, and in that capacity, she recently led the first review for 25 years of the conservation and population status of British mammals, and established EcoBats, a web-based tool to help interpret bat activity data. And again, she'll be looking at that today. Recent projects include assessing connectivity pathways for greater horseshoe bats using acoustic monitoring and circuitscape modeling, and assessing the impacts of road noise on bats. Currently, woodlands used by the rare barbicel bat are being identified using a citizen science project as well. And with all that, she had time to come and speak to us all today. So without further ado, I shall now hand you over to Professor Fiona Mathews.
Hello, my name's Fiona Mathews, and I'm going to talk to you today about work that I've done over many years, well, it's more than 10 years now, looking at bat activity and fatality rates at wind farms. And hopefully along the way, I'll give you some insights into deploying acoustic detectors. Now, it took a surprisingly long time for us to realise that there was an issue with bats at wind farms. In fact, people have been monitoring for raptor collisions at places like the Alternate Pass here for years and years before anybody noticed bats. And the reason for that is bats are small, and also when they do collide, you don't find great piles of them under wind turbines. What you're finding is one or two at a time. But it's the cumulative impact on this, on an organism that breeds very slowly, that means it's causing such conservation concern. And so as a consequence, there have been a number of publications from Eurobats, and we're actually just doing an update at the moment to produce guidance on monitoring for wind farms to look for bat casualties and also to assess bat activity. And just to put in context what scale of a problem we have, well, in Germany, the estimates are somewhere between 170,000 and 700,000 bats killed at wind farms, and at the UK, well, could be 34,000, but it's very, very difficult to put precise estimates just because there's not a lot of monitoring going on. So if we just quickly cover why bats might be being killed at wind farms, one is this is simply an accidental process. The bats are just flying into turbines as they should be minding their own business every night. Another suggestion is that actually this is migratory activity, and certainly in North America, there's quite a lot of evidence that that might be the case. Whether that's true in Europe is, I think, much, much less clear. However, we do know that at least some of the bats killed at wind farms do seem to be of origins other than that location. So this is some nice work done by Christian Voigt's group in Germany, looking at the probability of bats found at German wind farms, which is noted here. It's the probability of them having been derived, so having been born in that place. And you can see that actually they have a very low probability of origin in Germany, and instead probably originated in Northern Europe. And we know that these species, the Mathews pipistrelle in particular, is highly migratory. And so it's likely that at least some of those animals being killed by wind farms are actually encountering multiple wind farms along their path. And actually, this is a real concern in the UK, where and across actually the whole of the seaboard of Northern Europe. These are some movements that have been recorded recently of Mathews pipistrelles, with the lines showing the point of origin and where they ended up, and numerous passages down here, particularly in the North Sea, but also in the Baltic. And so that's a concern given the scale of development of offshore wind farms and also coastal wind farms. So all of these means that bats really are running the gauntlet during their migratory passages across Europe. It's also been suggested that possibly bats at wind farms are doing a mating display. However, again, it seems that maybe that's more true in North America than it is in Europe. So if we look at the peak display period for bats in Northern Europe, it seems the display period comes a little bit after the peaks in the numbers of fatalities. It could also be that bats are simply foraging around wind farms, and certainly our experience of using thermal imaging cameras suggests that bats are making repeated visits around turbine blades. And it's led to suggestions like this: maybe there's something attractive about the colour of wind farms. So when I got involved in this, basically in 2009, this was the league table of how many bats had been recorded dead at wind farms, with Germany way out there in the lead, top of the pops, with 1,066. And languishing at the bottom, as it always does in Eurovision, was the United Kingdom, which had very few fatalities indeed. But of course, that was really an artifact. It was simply a reflection of the fact that nobody was doing surveys, whereas in France and Germany there were quite extensive surveys going on. And that still remains a problem. There's uneven coverage across the different countries of Europe. So as a consequence of that, at that point I was at the University of Exeter, and I started the National Bats and Wind Turbines project that was funded by the 3 statutory nature conservation authorities of Britain, plus funding from Renewable UK. And what we studied was 46 sites that had large wind turbines, which at the time was about 23% of all eligible sites that had large turbines on them. And this is basically a snapshot study of going for 1 month per site. And we also did a separate study on small wind, which I won't talk much more about today. And subsequently, with my company, Ecology Search Services Limited, I've also been working with my colleague Catherine Evans, and we've done commercial surveys of more than 20 wind farm sites, including some extremely extensive sites in Scotland. So if you're going to do a survey at a wind farm, what is it you're trying to do? Basically, you're trying to say, are there any bats killed? If yes, how many? And what can be done about it? What can be done in terms of perhaps curtailment measures or other things? So you're trying to inform adaptive management of the site. And our primary tool in answering the first question of are bats killed, obviously that cannot be done just acoustically. I'll say it cannot be done. In my opinion, it can't be done acoustically. And that's simply because we have found very poor relationships between the numbers of bats found post-construction and actual casualty rates. And I think that's because there's just a lot of stochastic variation in casualty rates. Having said that, there are some sensor systems in place used in Germany in particular, which are attempting to reduce fatalities through minimising turbine or switching off turbines under certain conditions. And actually in the UK, there's several sites which are also using proactive curtailment with just a threshold cutoff to say, okay, we know that most casualties occur on less windy nights when the weather's warm, so we'll minimise blade rotation then. I think that's a bit different, though, from saying we can precisely estimate fatality rates from acoustic surveys. So anyway, we use search dogs, wonderful team of search dogs. But basically, our dogs go, and it's all a reward-based system. Basically, they find a bat, they get a ball. It's quite hard on the dogs, I have to say, as well as on the handlers. It's very intensive work. And this is my dog, Charlie Brown. Poor lad had to wear a boot for a while. You can see there, because he got damage to his paw from all that sharp gravel. But anyway, certainly much more effective than people. And my research showed that people pick up around a quarter or a third of the number of bats that dogs find. And we did find lots of bats, mainly common and soprano pipistrelles, but also some noctules and one or two other species. And frankly, a lot of these you would never have found just using a visual survey. You see how here this bat has actually been pulled right down into the gravel. I really don't think we'd have found that had it not been that we had a search dog. And even in upland areas, we're finding a lot of bats pulled down very rapidly, just within days, well, overnight even, by burying beetles. Okay, so in the UK, the main species at risk seem to be the Pipistrellus pygmaeus, and Nyctilus noctula. And if we place that in the context of their population sizes, we're racking up probably around 0.3 to 0.4% of the population per year. So this is a significant issue. Okay, so what are we going to do about this? How do we assess the risk? How do we decide what to do about it? Well, working with the 3 British statutory nature authorities, I contributed to the Bats and Onshore Wind Farms interim guidance that was published in 2019. That's freely available on the web. And basically what we do is the first step is to look at a matrix. So for each country, we look at the common species, rarer species, down to the rarest species, and we look at what their collision risk is. So basically you have a low collision risk, for example, for brown long-eared bats, whereas you've got a high collision risk for common soprano pipistrelles, but they're quite common, so possibly not such a concern. Whereas Mathews, pipistrelle, noctule, and liselers, we'd be very concerned about those. Let's think a bit more about how we go about doing acoustic surveys. And the first thing is we have worked with an awful lot of bat detectors. I had the first consignment of SM2 bat detectors used in the UK, and I think we had some pretty steep learning curves, and I'm happy to say that a lot of those have now been resolved. But anyway, this is where we started, with 80 bat detectors plus huge batteries. The primary issues that we had was actually just the power draw of SM2 and SM2 plus bat detectors. Even though we're working in wind turbines, which are generating electricity, we found it was actually very difficult to get permission to access that turbine power. And in any case, it was often intermittent, so you'd have to actually attach your battery to a trickle charger and then plug it into the turbine power supply. Now, on newer systems, so any that have got a SCADA control system, for example, there will be power, but nevertheless, it presents logistical issues. Remember, a lot of these sites are very remote, and the turbine company, frankly, does not want to be sending somebody out with you to unlock a turbine tower every time you're on site. Okay. We also had an issue that the batteries are very big for long-term deployment. Working a lot in Scotland, solar power doesn't seem a particularly good option. And also, in any case, even if I were working in more southerly locations, there are also issues with theft as well. So quite a lot of these sites are open access, and they do have problems with things being stolen from site. So we used a lot of gel lead acid batteries. It was a problem because the batteries were constantly running down and getting over discharge because of the power draw of the SM2. And so Wildcare actually made us these battery life extenders. I don't believe that they do them anymore, but it was good for us because it just stopped the power in the battery going below the threshold, at which point then the battery becomes defunct. But kind of to put some context on this, I reckon I've spent, both in terms of these gel lead acid batteries and rechargeable internal batteries, I must have spent upwards of £20,000 over the years on batteries, which is not only a big expense, but it also is a big concern in terms of rare earth metals and all the rest of it. Okay, the next thing to think about is where you're going to put your detector. Let's see if I can get this video to work. Yeah, there we go. So this is just some random sheep, but also we've got a lot of cattle. Cattle are very curious. They'll come and eat your cables. Sheep will just generally knock everything over. And so thinking about where to put your detector is quite a big thing. And particularly if you're doing work on multiple turbines or on multiple sites, as we've been, we want to have some consistency between the sites. And so we went with putting the detector actually on the steps of the turbine. So you can see the microphone is here with a cable running down, going to the battery pack there. Some of the newer turbines have an air conditioning system, which is here. I was worried that that was going to interfere with the recordings, but actually didn't have any problem from that, I'm happy to say. There's another thing that you're going to need in plentiful supply is gaffer tape. We use gaffer tape all the time, and even more so is cable ties. And I recommend that you get the releasable cable ties, because there's nothing more annoying than getting to site and realizing you forgot your penknife, so you can't get your cable ties off. Okay, but basically we cable tied to the railings there, and that kept stuff, well, it kept it reasonably dry because there's drain holes, and it also kept it out of the way of livestock. Okay, not all steps are similar height, so you can see this is a very short flight of steps here, but nevertheless we can normally manage to face you can't quite see the angle here, but it's horizontal angle facing away from the turbine tower. Now obviously what this is going to mean by putting it here is that your arc of detection isn't going to be 365 degrees, because anything that's flying behind the tower is going to be blocked by the tower itself, and that's just one of those things that you need to be aware of that as a constraint. You also need to think about the weather. This was on the way year before last. On the way to Scotland, I was thinking marvellous, yellow warning, heavy rain. And not only is there heavy rain, but at a lot of the sites we work at, there's also very, very considerable amounts of fog. So there's a lot of wetness just hanging about in the air. And there's also a great deal of wind. Let's see this one. So one of the issues is water ingress. You know, remember often the rain is driving, and the microphone, the case that goes over the microphone, the sponge, can get completely waterlogged. With the newer microphone types, we've had more success with drying them out and them being fine. And obviously the SM4s have the new shape of microphone. We did initially have some problems even with those, but I'm happy to say that Wildcare and Wildlife Acoustics did replace them for us, because they were marketed as being waterproof, but then all of the microphones, and again, it's something I spent many thousands of pounds on microphones that turned out to be dodgy. So Wildlife Acoustics, if you're listening, you really need to think about water. Particularly in Northern Europe, because we're getting water getting in at all these joints, and I'm still actually not happy with the cable connection at this end, on the right hand end of the cable, where the cable meets the microphone, because those bits are just falling to pieces all the time. So we end up wrapping insulation tape around to try and keep the water out. But I really think for the amount that we're paying, we need to be getting better at waterproofing stuff. We haven't had a problem from lightning strike. So initially, when we had problems with microphones, it was suggested that this was a lightning strike issue. I think that's very unlikely, because all our wind farms are monitored for lightning strike, and actually it's a pretty rare occurrence. I think, again, that's something that perhaps was thought to be a problem because of work in North America, but our experience on this side of the pond is actually that is not a big deal, and therefore I think it's actually fine to attach to the railings like that. In some cases, we've also attached to microphone on a bamboo cane as well, to give a little bit of extra protection. Okay, another thing to think about is electrical interference. There's often transformer stations, as here. More often than not, we haven't had a problem with that, but there are cases where we have, and it doesn't necessarily seem to be at every single turbine. So this was a site in Northern Ireland. It's an older style of wind energy installation. You can see here we've got a bamboo cane here with the microphone attached to it, and we were getting interference from that transformer station. Be mindful that things can happen at wind farms when you're not there. So in this case, these all got repainted and the stuff got moved, something that we hadn't really anticipated happening. And yeah, my general message is always test your microphones before you deploy them. You should use either the Wildlife Acoustics calibrator, or we use that, but we also use an acoustic lure playing known frequencies at known decibels, and then also check them when you go and do your battery replacement check. So I would say you need to be checking those microphones every month, because if not, you're going to have big periods where you're not recording anything, or it's going to be suboptimal. And I think that's a big problem, and people don't pay nearly enough attention to taking care of their microphones. Also test your cables, because cables also get knackered really quickly. Remembering you've got large amounts of equipment, probably it's going in the back of your car. Take care that your microphones, that you test all your different cables that you're going to use before you get on site in the first place to deploy. Okay, we've also deployed in the nacelle. So this is a view down from the nacelle. So, and the first thing to say is you're probably going to have to be accompanied, or the installation will be done without you being there, by the turbine technicians. And what we discovered is that a lot of companies just simply don't want people who are not their own staff inside the turbine, because there are confidentiality or concerns around using images or whatever of technology. And so generally speaking, they do not want you up the tower. I do know of one ecologist in Germany, Lauterbach, who regularly goes up turbine towers, but I think he's one of the exceptions, and even if you've got a climbing license. So you're putting yourself in the hands of your turbine operator and their technicians. In terms of practically how to do it, I don't even see here, we had a piece of conduitry, just electrical conduit tubing, and split it at the end here. These are exposed, and Then thread the microphone down so it sticks out at the bottom. The aim here is to get your microphone at least 1 meter or 2 meters away from the noise that is in the nacelle. Size, really. And then you poke it out through the any suitable hole. Could be a wind shaft, could be a drain exposed. Occasionally we put them up at the top, but you get a lot of exposure to weather there. I'd recommend below probably. And then you need to gaffer tape everything in place like mad. Site. Gaffer tape is the rule to everything. There's the equipment in amongst all the gubbins in the nacelle. And here you go. Here's a picture of a microphone sticking out through the winch hatch. Would I bother doing this? Probably not, unless a client actually really insists on it. The reason being is you get a lot more calls at ground level than you do at the nacelle. Now, no great surprise about that, because you're going to get more bat activity. But I think you're also getting a lot more wind interference at height, and a lot more noise, despite your best efforts, a lot more noise from the nacelle. We actually found a poorer correlation between activity measured at the nacelle and casualty rates than we did with data collected from the ground. And you still have to bear in mind that even though you're more in the zone at risk, again, you still have huge issues because you're obviously not monitoring any of this area. And also, if you think about the radius of your microphone, even for a pipistrelle bat, you can pick up what, about 30 meters from that microphone, whereas your turbine blade might well be 100 meters. So you're really getting a tiny fraction of the bat activity there. So in terms of where is a good place to sample, I think for logistical reasons and for the lack of good evidence that this is much better, I would stick with doing them at the ground. That's just a view. Okay, and then of course your bat detectors are chugging away and you're collecting mountains and mountains and mountains of data. I think the first thing to say is when you put your SD cards in, make sure you label them with the unique ID of your card, of your bat detector, because that means when you go back to site, you can just take out those cards and replace them with fresh ones, rather than having to fiddle about in the driving rain or the fog or the howling gale to try and download that data in the field. The next thing is think about how you're going to back up your data. I always backed it up to a laptop and also to a portable hard drive. Bear in mind that phone connections are often really intermittent at these sites because often they're very remote, and we certainly didn't see how we would reasonably be able to use automatic detectors, automatic downloads of data. So we had the dual backup in the field and then stored it on a NAS RAID drive when we got back to the office. Okay. And then you've got all your wonderful data analysis to do. We've used Kaleidoscope for just about all of our data analysis. And in that initial project, we had over 4 million files and nearly 400,000 calls. And what do we actually do with all that? I'm obviously not going to go through now how to do bat acoustic analysis, but I'm just going to think in the last 5 minutes about how we might make use of the data. And the first thing to do is, well, this is a table taken from that standing guidance on bats and wind farms. You can find it on the Scottish Natural Heritage, or Nature Scot they are now. If you Google bats and wind farm guidance, you'll find this. Okay, so what happens is basically the site is ranked in terms of risk linked with habitat. So basically this is a very open site that looks like it's not going to be very batty, through to somewhere with lots of woodland where you'd expect lots of bats there, perhaps in a more lowland area. Okay, and each of those is given a score, and then there's also a score that goes with project size, going from small to medium to large. The reason that project size is important is in the National Bats and Wind Farm project, we found a pretty much uniform increase in the risk to bats with each additional turbine added. So it wasn't that big sites were somehow exponentially more at risk, but they did have a steady increase for each turbine that you add. So in other words, if you've got a massive site, 10 times as large as another one, your risk is 10 times higher. Okay, and then the next thing was to take those site level risks, and then that's multiplied by the EcoBat activity category based on the acoustic data to come up with either very low activity or very high activity. And I'll explain a little bit more about the EcoBat categories now. Okay, so EcoBat is a collaborative project led by the Mammal Society. It's funded by NERC initially. It's also been funded by, had contributions from CEH and from the University of Sussex, and we work in collaboration with BCT and other organisations. And the prompt for this is realising that the sort of activity indices often found in EIAs is not actually terribly useful at all. What's this meant to mean for anyone? I don't know. So, and a second concern was that we realised that actually a lot of basic mathematical issues are making EIAs actually quite misleading. Okay. And I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. So one is most reports will just talk about the median activity level per night or across a month or something. And this is fairly typical of what activity can look like at a site. So this is the mean, this is the median. The median actually comes out at 0 because most nights have very low activity. So if you said a median of 0, that's not very informative, is it? Second site here, well, here we've got a massively higher mean compared with the median because you've got all these data points up here that are pulling the mean up. Okay, but again, the median is 0. And what both of those measures, the mean and the median, are missing are the nights of high activity, like this one here, or even that one there, that could mean that these are the times of highest risk. It makes sense to think that most of your risk is going to be concentrated on those occasional nights, and it fits with our understanding of risk being concentrated where the weather's warm and the wind speed is low. Okay. So what EcoBat does is it compares activity at a site compared with others in the region. And it also gives some other useful information like when the bat detectors actually recorded bats. So that's helpful in terms of cross-checking with your equipment. So these are the nights, these are your detectors, and it shows you where the holes are. So you might want to think, actually, did I have a soggy microphone during that period there? Whereas these gaps are likely to be actually just true gaps where bat activity was very low. You can also look at things like the timing of the activity compared with sunset in order to work out whether it's likely that there's a maternity roost close by. And the really critical part are these activity centiles, where what it does is it takes activity at your site and it compares it with activity at all other sites that we know about within a given radius, and that's what the user can specify what the radius is. So at this site, for example, we say, okay, at turbine 1, activity is around the 40th centile. That means the 60 out of 100 sites would have higher activity and 40 out of 100 would have lower activity. Okay, whereas at turbine 2, it's a bit higher. And that information on the centiles then feeds back into that whole risk assessment. How risky do we think this site is to bats? If it's a high centile level, then we think it was risky. And we might also want to go and look at what's the maximum pass rate per detector per night within a particular period. And you can see, for example, here that this turbine has basically the redder the colour and the larger the blob, the more worrying that site is. So it looks like we've got, this is just the latitude and longitude of the turbine. So this turbine looks like it might be a problem for common and soprano pipistrelles because it's got a real peak in activity going on, whereas nothing for the others really. Okay, I'm going to finish there, but thank you very much. If you've got any questions, I'd be happy to take them. You can contact me via Twitter, or you can email me either at the University of Sussex or at fiona@ecologyservices.co.uk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, as always. I'm biased because I've seen Fiona present quite a lot. Being from the same country, it's quite easy. We have got lots of questions, and we've kind of like pulled out some. So if you want me to go through a few, I'm happy to do that and see what you think. So would you be able to share the second model of calibrator you used to test the microphones?
Yeah, so what it is, well, I've actually used two different ones, and they're both acoustic lures. So I've got both a Pearsonic lure and an 8100 lure, but I guess any lure where you know what frequency you're producing and what your amplitude is would do. Really, it's just a question. It's to see, are you recording what you think you are recording? And you can use that either to play back constant frequencies, or you could play back real call sounds if you wanted. It just gives you a I don't know if you've used the calibrator for microphones. It's not exactly a calibration process, is it, Paul? We've also got an SPL, yeah. And as you turn your mic, you'll tend to find that the value that you get will differ. We do also have an SPL meter, sound pressure meter, that we have used on occasion, but I wouldn't. That's quite technical to use, and I probably wouldn't use that in the field. So what we tend to do is a big test before we start a season's deployment to make sure all the microphones are good. And then in the field, we tend to use the small calibrator that Paul was just waving there every time we go back and download data.
Yeah, it's to be small in the field. It's yeah, the word calibrator is the wrong word.
Yeah, it's the wrong word.
Everyone uses the word calibrator, but it's a tester is probably the best way of describing it.
Yeah.
So we've got another controversial question here. I would be interested in hearing from any of the panelists on their experience of working with song meters versus other commonly used passive acoustic devices like audio moths or Swifts or whatever devices that you might be familiar with. So basically, I'll do that.
All right. Well, funnily enough, on my desk, I have here an audio moth in a little box. So for me, for long-term deployment, I've really enjoyed using SM2s, and certainly for us, they were the best thing available at the time. I mean, bearing in mind also that at the time, the main there wasn't the range of bat detectors available that there are now. For me, so far, possibly the main issue with the audio moth has been the lack of trigger. So the SD cards basically permanently recording is a problem, though I am just about to try a firmware update to deal with that. I think I'm suspecting that the microphone isn't going to be as good, maybe. And it's going to have, I mean, to me, it kind of takes me back to the days when we all used to use Anabats and put them in plastic lunch boxes with bits of acoustic sponge over the front. So all the problems that I've talked about with water ingress, for example, as soon as you go back to the more sort of DIY versions like this, that's the problem that I could see. So I think it partly depends on your purpose. So I would say horses for courses. If you're doing large scale studies in really challenging environments, and the data is, it's really important to you to get consistent data, for example, across all your turbines, that's one thing. If you're trying to do an inexpensive project, just perhaps as a first look and see, perhaps not a commercial survey, then you might want to look at alternative technologies. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. So well, we've got one about your kind of work with wind turbines here, more specifically. How did you determine presumed risk to particular species without sampling beforehand? I also assume that this varies over the course of the year depending on the site.
Yeah, so the short answer to that is we didn't. So the risk, well, it's not quite true to say we didn't have any information to start with. So we looked at risk based on numbers of reported casualties from across Europe, but then those tables that were part of that talk are based essentially on the outcomes of the monitoring project. So we looked at which species had the highest collision rates, and also thought about that in the context of what we know about the abundance of those species.
Cool, we're back on kit again. Have you used MIDI bats? And if so, have you had water problems with the mics? No. No.
Sorry, I was just going to explain as well what I meant by water ingress, and perhaps Paul can say something about it. This is the problem that, I don't know if you can see this, that I tend to have, of microphones coming apart here and here. Where so it's by the connector, and that's the bit that always comes undone. So even though I think a lot of the problems, like with the SM4, I think the microphones are much better and more robust and seem a lot more waterproof, but we've still got the problem where the connectors are joining the machines.
So this is so we got rid of one connector, which is that end, so that doesn't exist anymore. Which
exactly,
is
but you still got it at the other end.
You've got to have one at the other end. They are sort of like screwed. I suppose it's been bent and things like that, and maybe that's to do with it. So we'll look at it. That's it. We work off feedback, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I did wonder whether you could do something with sort of shrink wrap or something that went over this whole thing, or you need it sort of molded, because it does seem a real weak point. And as I say, we've got hundreds and hundreds of cables, and it's always that bit.
Keeping off putting new connectors and getting shorter and shorter. We'll throw it to our engineers. It's their problem. What we've got here. Oh, can you elaborate a little more on the purple coloured turbine? Didn't know bats cared about colour.
Yeah, so that was a paper, it was a slight wildcard paper that suddenly appeared a few years ago, and it wasn't really so much the bats as the paper was suggesting that insects were differentially attracted to different shades of white, and the people who'd done the project had basically looked at insects landing on different coloured pieces of card and concluded that purple would be the optimal colour, and presented this in the context of wind farms, which the media got terribly excited about. Of course, I don't think there's much likelihood of a purple turbine because of all the landscape issues, whereas they are designed to somewhat blend into the sky. I think that's why they're all that gunmetal shades of white.
Yeah, I did hear about that. I went to a presentation a long time ago, and someone was talking about bird collision with wind turbines and painting the ends of them. And he did his entire end of his presentation through the medium of interpretive dance, which I thought was quite
fantastic.
Good. Excellent. Fantastic. It's just what you want. Someone's asked a good question here. Can we estimate the number of bats that pass using acoustic data?
I think that's very, very difficult. I think if you wanted to do that at all, you'd have to have a site-by-site calibration exercise where you're using some second measure like infrared or thermal imaging. I mean, one thing I would say about wind energy sites is, you know, these are quite challenging places to work. We have done some work with thermal cameras, but it's quite difficult because of things like the contrast with the blade. And of course you've set your field of view, and unless you've got multiple cameras, it's difficult to triangulate and work out exactly where the bat is. There's some very neat work by Frank Boccaroso's group working on the hoary bat, Hawaiian hoary bat, that has used that method. I think the short answer is it's really quite tricky. I think nevertheless acoustic information is telling us something, because even if it's the same bat flying round and round and round, you would assume that then is putting that individual at increased risk.
We've got a few more. They just keep coming in, but I don't know whether we'll get through them all. But we'll. Should we be giving an anticipated error rating when reporting our activity levels? The error level would presumably be lower for sites where we've done more nights of survey.
Yeah, definitely. And if you use EcoBat, which actually comes on to the next question, which yes is free and anybody can use it. It does give you outputs that calculate error. It gives you, basically, it will show you what the variability is in your data from night to night or month to month or between turbines and so on. So yeah, I think there is a lot of variability, and I think probably as ecologists we should be thinking more about that because it is important. Yeah. And one point I was going to say, I can't even remember now whether I mentioned it in the talk, is also when you're doing acoustic surveys at wind farms and people get very, there's often this debate about should we monitor in the nacelle or not. And I think one of the issues with the nacelle is even at the nacelle, you're only measuring a fairly small fraction of the total sweep of the rotor blade. So if you think now, many of the modern turbines might have 100-meter blades. So we're measuring what, 20 to 30-meter radius? And then some of that's blocked out because you've got the nacelle in the way. So that's a barrier, the nacelle being the bit at the top that the blades are attached to, where all the gears and engineering works is. So you've got quite a small area that you're sampling. So I think we just always need to bear that in mind, that when we're assessing bat activity at wind farms, what we're doing is we're taking quite a small sample of the total area, and we just need to be upfront about that. And that's true if you're measuring at the nacelle, it's true if you're measuring at the ground. We've got a sample, but samples can still be useful.
Are you going to ask for a device that's going to put a detector on each blade as it's going around? Is that your request?
Lovely. We have talked about that.
Very dizzy turbines.
I mean, for offshore, we haven't talked about offshore here, but offshore deployment, is a real problem. We are going to have to get to grips with how to work in that even more challenging environment. Yeah.
So going back to your EcoBats program, we've got a question: is EcoBat a program that is available for any research, like other types of bat research?
Yes, it's free, it's open access. What you won't be able to do with it is, so one part of it is it will take your calls and it will look at how many calls you've got per night at your site, and it will compare it with other sites, and you can set a distance like within 100 kilometers or something. So it's comparing with other acoustic data that we've already got in the system. Now, if you're from, I don't know, Sri Lanka or Cuba or something, we're not going to have data for you to compare with, but all the other functions, so the stuff that tells you, how many nights your detector's been working, the simple, the output graph and so on, that's all freely available and would work for anywhere in the world. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I think we've pretty much gone through everything.
Yeah.
And all I can do is to thank you once again.
You're welcome.
For a wonderful talk and being here as well for a Q&A. It really is appreciated. So I don't know whether we've got reactions, but if people want to clap, they can very well clap or put thumbs up and things like that.
Thank you. And I'll type answers to the questions that we didn't manage to get through.
Oh, thank you so much, Fiona. Much appreciated.
You're welcome.